Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 53rd episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. And today's episode is all about celebrating our first birthday. Woohoo! A full 52 episodes of the Diverse Minds podcast. And I want to share with you the 5 key things I've learned over these 52 episodes. I'm aware that podcasts have been the thing during lockdown, and a number of celebrities and people have started theirs. And I'm really pleased that I started my podcast in September 2019. And if you want to know more about why I did and the journey to episode number 1, please do listen to my first episode and the links in the show notes. All I can say is what a 12 months it's been, or year, because I still think in academic years, so my year starts in September. I didn't think January 2020 was going to be great, but seriously, I didn't see a pandemic coming. And there've also been a number of curveballs, which meant that I had to adapt my content and what I was going to do. So one of the first things I wanted to talk about is why it took me so long to start a podcast, even though it was in my mind from the time I started my business in earnest in October 2017. I didn't really know where to start with the tech, and I think one of the things I would say is if you do want to start a podcast, it's making sure that you've got help, you've got someone with knowledge who can help you, and to really push you and make sure that you plan things properly. So often the tech challenges can overwhelm us. And that's why it's really important to get help, I think, when you're starting a podcast. Someone who can help you plan out your content, who can advise you on sound files, whether that's joining a Facebook group, looking at experts. But that's one of the reasons that held me back. And I also thought, what would I talk about? So that brings me to the second point about finding my voice or finding your voice and what to talk about. And also not expecting the podcast to hit the charts or your podcast to hit the charts straight away unless you're a very well-known name and you're a celebrity. So the way in which I planned it out is I worked with my podcast producer, Xavier Ume, and we sat down and we planned out 12 months worth of content. And a lot of that was based on the blogs that I'd written over the previous year. And that's also a really helpful starting point. Now, I'm not a writer. I'm not someone, and you've heard me say this before, who enjoys writing particularly. But I am very glad that I took the time to blog because it does help your search engine optimization, SEO, for your website. So then you can then build a platform and an audience who can then listen to your podcasts. You can also use your blogs as content generation and to give you ideas for things to talk about. And you have a format and a layout set out within your blogs. So that's the first thing we did. Now, of course, as a result, my podcasts have covered really broad topics, which I think have been useful, and I've known guests to contact and people to reach out to because I had that content plan. I think doing it from week to week would be incredibly difficult. And also it means that even if you do want to change things, you've got an overall structure about where you're heading. And sometimes when you have very little time, it's a great way to make sure that you know what you're doing and you've got clarity. I think what's also interesting for me has been seeing or finding out which episodes have been the most popular and not necessarily the things I expected. So something that's really struck me is most of my episodes with guests have not been the most widely listened to, which is not what I was expecting, but in fact, the solo episodes that I have done. So my third point really is about statistics, and not to get too hung up on them, but how they can inform your podcast and what you do. In order, the most popular episodes have been firstly episode number 40, which was done during the height of this particular wave of Black Lives Matter in June 2020, called Racism and Genuine Allyship. My second most popular episode, which was in fact a guest episode with the wonderful Monica Mwanje and Michelle Gima, was Negotiating Something Better. So this was specifically about Black global majority and women of colour negotiating something better for themselves at work. The third most popular episode was why I started Diverse Minds. So that's the episode I referred to, my very first episode. The fourth most popular episode was Resilience and Mental Health, which again was recorded during the pandemic. And it's also based on a blog post. Now, the fifth most popular episode I am a bit surprised about because at the time I didn't really feel it got that much traction, but it is in fact how and why to talk about suicide for Suicide Prevention and Awareness Day on the 10th of September. And then finally, Black mental health, how to engage your staff. So this was an episode marrying together mental health for Black History Month and talking about the Black global majority patients of colour experience around mental health and mental ill health. And as I mentioned, of course, I didn't plan to do episodes on coronavirus, on the pandemic, around isolation. But that ability to be flexible and adapt was super helpful because I then had to scratch a lot of the episodes I had planned, especially because a number of guests were busy and trying to kind of survive and keep their head above water. They didn't necessarily have time, but that there's a series of podcast episodes about well-being during coronavirus, solopreneurs' mental health in the pandemic, and lots of other episodes that did get more traction than I expected. A more popular one recently, not all-time popular, but was about patience, passion, and persistence, and the things that I'd learned during the pandemic. Then, of course, there's my wonderful guests. So that I've been very fortunate to have guests. And my aim with the podcast, and this is one of the things I put in my application for the Asian Business Chamber of Commerce Awards for the Best Business for Diversity and Inclusion, which I won in December 2019, was to make sure that people who don't normally get their voice heard to be heard. So the primary focus for a lot of my podcast guests is to make sure that they're from Black and global majority backgrounds, people that know their stuff, and people that are really keen to share their knowledge and also talk from a culturally diverse perspective. So, I mean, I love all of my guests and I've learned so much from them, but I think some of the top ones for me was my most recent guest, the writer and author Masuda Snaith, who talks about her journey to becoming a writer, how she pushes back against stereotypes as a South Asian woman and how she has to do this consistently, and also provides some really great tips for people who want to be writers. Oris Ikiyomi's episode, which was super popular actually, on men's mental health. Again, he has a Nigerian heritage and he talks about that, and men's mental health that covers different ages, and that was in June. The body image episode with Sarah Daisy Bernard, and that was fantastic. So she gives so many insights, and she has a dual heritage background, and she talks about that and learned so much around, don't avoid talking about being fat, don't avoid saying the word fat. It's really important. It's not about losing weight, it's about health, and some really interesting things that she had to say. Of course, Dr. Annabelle Shoemimo, the founder of Decolonizing Contraception, and that episode's been super popular about sex, mental health, and people of colour. So I would definitely check out that and definitely check out Decolonizing Contraception. The wonderful Patrick Vernon, so Windrush campaigner, who taught me so much about Windrush and how we can all get involved in the Windrush campaign, and actually the scandal is not over. Omar Salah, who talked about Ramadan in COVID and under lockdown, and how to bring people together even though they may have of different religions and those of no religion, and how important Ramadan was. So that was super helpful. My first guest, the wonderful Versha Patel, who runs vershapatel.com, talking about Self-Care September and fitness, particularly for women who've just had children, and how to look after themselves, how to think about the health of their bodies, and how that contributes to them being a better parent. The Diwali episode blew my mind, as with Manish Dayal, who is a doctor in the Royal Navy, and that's a fantastic episode. And he talks a lot about diversity and inclusion in the Navy, in the armed forces, and how it is taken really seriously, and his personal lived experience of that, which is an incredibly positive one. I've had the phenomenal Kate Nash, who is the founder of Purple Space for Disability History Month, and the wonderful Steph Cutler, who also contributed to Disability History Month, and she has her own podcast called Aperture, and she is the CEO of Making Lemonade and talks about her own lived experience of having an acquired visual impairment. And of course, how could I forget Mac Alonge, who talks about using data and how data can drive your Black History Month. And I know I've missed out a few guests there. Andrea Rainsford, Jess Green, who talked about her poetry. Andrea, her really difficult journey to running her own business, recovering from physical and mental ill health. Petra Veltsaboa, and the eating disorders campaigner Hope Virgo. So I've had some brilliant people, and inadvertently I think I've missed out a few, but do check out those episodes, and I'm really fortunate enough to have these people in my network as well. I think one of the things that I've often shied away from is talking about my personal journey in terms of my lived experience of racism, of mental health, of mental ill health. But I thought no one would want to hear that. And that's why I'm really shocked that the most popular episode has been about racism and genuine allyship, because that is, for me, is the most raw episode, where I talk about my own lived experience of race and racism and how it's been a strand through my life. So what I would say is that you do have a story and people need to hear it, because if not, who? And of course, this is much easier to say to other people than to remind yourself about it. But I hope that I will be sharing some more personal insights, because clearly that does resonate with people and people want to hear about it. But I'm so much more focused on kind of being professional and finding the research and finding credible sources, that often I shy away from it. And I do find it difficult to talk about myself, but it's been heartening to see the numbers, not only just to see the numbers, but hearing from listeners who message me on LinkedIn, who send me emails, who message me through my website. So I absolutely love hearing from listeners. So please get in touch with me. I absolutely love hearing from you. And while we're thinking about listeners and stats, I just wanted to share the sort of profile of the listeners. So 81% of you as listeners are from the UK, and my podcast is very UK focused. 5% from Ireland, 3% from the US, 1% from Canada, 1% from Germany, and then under 1% from a mix of countries. But I'm really pleased to see Sudan is up there in the kind of the top countries under 1%, if you like. Indian listeners, Uzbekistan, Turkey, South Africa, New Zealand, UAE, Azerbaijan, Sweden. I'm so honoured. And even if it's just 1 or 2 listens, it's really lovely to see those figures. And then in terms of the gender breakdown, and this doesn't surprise me, but I just wanted to share that 66% of the listeners are female, 32% are male, 1% not specified, and 1% non-binary. And the age brackets was really interesting for me as well. So the highest the highest percentage of listeners are from the 23 to 27-year-old age bracket, so younger than me, because I'm 38, followed by 28 to 34-year-olds. Then 35 to 44-year-olds, so my age bracket, then the 18 to 22-year-olds, then 45 to 59-year-olds, and then 60 plus and 0 to 17 are both at 2%. Now, it could be to do with the generation and the age groups that listen to podcasts. But again, that's great for me to see and interesting. I think that, I wouldn't have expected that. So it's interesting for me to see those stats. And then most of you listeners like to listen on Spotify. That's 54%, Apple Podcasts 25%, Player FM 4%, Overcast 3%, and other sources 14%. And also that 31% of you listen on an iPhone, and 11% on Android, and 58% on other. So I just wanted to share those with you because I thought you might like to know, and I know some of you who like stats might like to know sort of where you fit in. And my average audience size per week varies from 80 to 42. And when I first started, that was 18. So remember, you're not going to get huge, unless, like I said, you're a celebrity, you won't get huge numbers of listeners, but that's okay, because you need to think about what's your podcast for. And I think for me, it was about sharing knowledge and showing my thought leadership. So what about the next 12 months ahead? Well, I have made a commitment to carry on doing podcasts 1 a week. And I'm going to really be niching down and focusing on 4 key areas. And they are going to be race and race equality. That's kind of one area. Mental health and well-being. That's the second area. Black, global majority, and women of colour. So having guests from that background and also talking about specific issues that speak to Black, global majority, and women of colour. And to share more of my own personal journey. Now, of course, I'd love your help in order to help me do this well and effectively. And I'd love for you to help me shape the next episodes. And in order for you to do this, I have created a quick survey to find out what you'd like, what you've enjoyed, and how useful you find the content of the podcast. As I said, I've had some lovely people I don't know at all reach out to me, and that's always a joy. So if you do want to do that, remember you can find me on LinkedIn, Layla Okai. I've also got a Diverse Minds company page on LinkedIn. On Facebook, it's Diverse Minds, the page, and I've also got my Facebook group, Wellbeing 365. And on Twitter, the handle is @Diverse Minds UK. But please do think about filling out the survey. It's really quick. There's quick questions just for me to get a bit of a sense. And I've already had some feedback from a listener who wants me to interview someone from a white majority background in an organisation who now feels more comfortable speaking about race from being from a place where they felt really frightened. So if you're listening and that sounds like you, please get in touch with me if you want to be a guest. And if you fill out the survey, you've got an opportunity of having an on-air coaching session with me. So that's a podcast session where you will be coached on an issue related to your work-life balance or race equality or well-being. And that would be offered free. So the value of that is £150. So please do fill out the survey. And I just wanted to also say that, if you want to start a podcast, absolutely go for it. But my top tips are to consider who you want to speak to, as in who your podcast is going to speak to, how you're going to maintain momentum. Thirdly, make sure that you do the planning and make time for that. Fourthly, whose voices is it that you want to amplify? So what kind of guests and people that you want on the show. Fifth, that you might feel like you're speaking into thin air, and that's okay. And the same if you've started a blog, you feel like you're blogging into thin air and talking to yourself, but it's that constant consistency, and it's okay. And remember that you just need to keep going. You might have to flex and adapt your plan, but it's great to have a plan in the first place. And don't be afraid to reach out to other podcast hosts, be on their podcast, build your audience. And you don't have to be tech perfect, but also think about who's going to help you. So thank you so much for being a listener, and thank you so much for being part of the Diverse Minds podcast. I never really thought, it's kind of surreal that it's been going for a year and I've completed this at the end of this 53 episodes. Wow. I also am aware that a lot of people, when they start podcasts, they might do 2 or 3 episodes a week, or, some people do 100 episodes in 100 days. They kind of batch record them and release them. And that does help listener figures. But due to all the client work I have, that wasn't possible. But here I am, episode 53, first birthday. And it's been such a joy hearing from you and getting your feedback. So please don't forget to check out the form on the show notes. It won't take you long. And I really would love you to input into it. And you've got a chance to win an on-air coaching session with me worth £150. So until next week, where we'll be hearing more about mental health, inclusion, race and race equality, I wish you all the best, and here's to the next 12 months.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.